Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here for the third time, and thanks again to Bernard, to Caroline, for the wonderful welcome, and thank you for listening to my paper in English. I hope you can find, or that you have, it's been posted so you can follow it as well. So I'll read it, the same version. In his second letter to the Thessalonians, the Apostle Paul tries to bring a congregation back to the fold. The Thessalonians have begun thinking that the end of times have arrived and that the Messiah has returned, or was just about to do so. Paul says that such messages, delivered either by spirit or by word, should be treated with suspicion, for the first event of the end times is the revelation of the man of lawlessness. That is to say, the son of destruction, referred to as the Antichrist in the Gospel of John and the beast of the sea in the Apocalypse of John. The coming of the man of lawlessness thus signals the beginning of the end. But this event is, says Paul, in a famously vague passage, held back by the restraining force, the Katechon. It keeps us within a time before the Messianic, in which we find the mystery of lawlessness still at work. So Paul was trying to establish a church, a new organization of believers, and the levels of messianic convictions that the Thessalonians were showing went against his efforts. A believer convinced that the end time, Eschaton, had arrived and that an apocalypse had occurred in terms of truth being revealed, had to make his private peace with the true Christ returned and stay as far away from the false one as possible. In this, there was no more space for a church, either one was redeemed or one was not. The wait for the news of redemption, and even worse, the despondency at thinking that one might have missed it, led to passivity. Paul told the Thessalonians to follow him, stay clear of false teachers, and not to be undisciplined or idle. They should continue to work, Paul admonishes them. Living after the beginning of the end time was easy. Before that, one needed to make an effort in order to survive. At 3 of the 4 walls of Sala dei Novi, Hall of the Nine, in the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena, the lawmakers of the city's council met under Ambrogio Lorenzetti's large frescoes, the allegory of good and bad government. Painted 1338 to 1339. The leaders of the famously divided city were to come to their political agreements looking at, and maybe more importantly, being under the gaze of, a number of scenes that mirrored each other. First, the allegory of good government, with its personifications of the virtues, justice as queen and wisdom as king, surrounded by figures such as hope and a woman representing peace pleasantly reclining. That's the woman in white. The allegory of bad government, on the other hand, is headed by a devil-like figure, tyranny served by 3 vices: avarice, vainglory, and arrogance. Peace is now in shackles. That's her down there. If good government is achieved, Lorenzetti argues through illustrations, the effects follow. In 2 big scenes, one of the city and the other of the country, he shows a desirable outcome. In the city, trade is vibrant and houses are being constructed, and people even have leisure to dance in the streets. In the country, visibly a representation of the real country around Siena, peasants are busy tending the fields and merchants travel unmolested with their goods. The effects of bad government are represented through the inverse imagery: a gloomy city in disrepair, no dancing in the streets, and a countryside with idle fields ravished by war and fires. The illustrations of Lorenzetti is in one way a childishly uncomplicated as it is self-conscious. There is, as it were, no doubt of what the wish of the artist is. The idealistic language is self-evident. The good equals the beautiful and the true. It is a dream, in short. Or it can be read as a combination of a nightmare and a dream of something good in the most general notion of the terms. If it had been an unconscious dream, little work would have been needed in interpreting it. Following Sigmund Freud's interpretation of dreams, it is possible to argue that Lorenzetti's frescoes, read as dreams, show minimal difference between manifest and latent content. It contains little of the classical elements that interpretation needs to unpack, like condensations and displacements. It is as though the real work is to take place underneath the paintings, by the men in charge, in using the dream as a basis for a new and hopefully good act. Still, Lorenzetti's fresco is captivating to this day. Despite its clear, self-evident Christian imagery, there is something curiously relevant about the way in which the split between the good and bad is presented in such worldly and political terms. The leaders of Siena were supposed to ponder over the two futures presented to them, and they were in no uncertain terms invited to work towards the good. But this, and here there is still scope for interpretation, at the same time as evil always resided together with the good. It perpetually threatened to return to the city of Siena and the country surrounding it, and as a threat it can never be eradicated from the room of power. If we read Lorenzetti's fresco as a dream, the wish that it appears to express becomes a performative representation of the aim of dream interpretation, to find the wish, which is always positive, in what more than often are gruesome nightmares. The difference is that Lorenzetti takes one more step and identifies his wish with a general good, whereas the wish in dreams for Freud could be a highly particular good of dubious moral value. The allegory is, in other words, a political wish, the expression of political desire. Therapeutics is work, a service, undertaken to combat illness and alleviate pain. In other words, dependent on a pharmacological understanding that the curative and the toxic are in a constant relationship in which the survival is predicated on a striving towards the curative. By painting two possible futures in the same room of power, it is as though Lorenzetti wanted to state that both do exist at the same time, but that those serving the common good always need to bring the act from the negative to the positive end. Earthly humans here and now, a here and now as present in the day of Lorenzetti as today, are not altogether good, healthy or redeemed, or altogether bad, sick and damned, but their goodness is measured in the way that the bad is transformed into the good, and their capacity to do evil is related to instances where the good is transformed into the bad. The latter mode of negative development representing an anti-therapeutics, a refusal to serve the good that Lorenzetti tried to dissuade from by showing absolutely no advantage to the anti-therapeutic turn. Paul's concept of the restraining force, the Katechon, was interpreted by Carl Schmitt as a secular political power. Indeed, the church itself became in the guise of the Christian empire. This Catholicism without Christianity formed the ground for the political theology of Schmitt, painting a world held from the brink of chaos by an intervening earthly sovereign. He even retrospectively saw himself in the role of the Katechon, convenient for a man whose adherence to the Nazi movement was justified in terms of evading an apocalyptic unraveling. The theoretical and historical context of Schmitt's use of the Katechon was new, but little else. The restrainer had traditionally been seen as a political force, sometimes interpreted as the Roman Empire, and at other times identified with the Christian Church. An extreme example of this Katechon is Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor in The Brothers Karamazov, who rejects the returned Messiah on the grounds that the Church no longer has any need of him. Giorgio Agamben's interpretation of the Katechon is, in contrast to Schmitt, that it is not merely a force postponing the apocalypse, but an indication that a fight between good and evil is happening also now, in historical time. In Agamben's view, the end time, the Eschaton, becomes merely a parable for the reality that we are living in, which the good is already irredeemably split from the bad. But this line of reasoning makes it necessary for Agamben to see the continuity between Paul's mystery of lawlessness and the lawless man of the Antichrist. The Antichrist is already at work in the world, helped by the Katechon, or indeed as the Katechon itself, to remain intertwined with the good. Political power is already beyond the law, legality without legitimacy that obscures the fact that we exist in a clear-cut messianic present. So between those two positions, I'm going to argue for a third one. The real political secular world between the morality and Schmidt and the messianic time of the final judgment as always already at play for Agamben, it is possible to try to locate what we can call the time of therapeutics, before the end with its last judgment. This was perhaps what both Paul and Lorenzetti tried to communicate, or so we can argue after therapeutically using the pharmaca of the word and the image that have retained their expressions and reading them like dreams, dreams that Freud taught us contain both past as memory and the future as wish or desire. What if we are to read the notion of the mystery of anomia, lawlessness, the outside of law, as trying to describe the radical ambivalence of the pharmacological situation in which man and things that man has made and that have made man are always curative to the same extent that they are toxic? Paul was, after all, such a human being, this man who persecuted the Christians and then became the leader of the sect. Outside of the law here becomes an outside of the final judgment. This does not mean that all is allowed, but rather that the final result of the struggle is unknown, and that we participate in this mystery-like drama and thus have the ability to affect the outcome. When the Greek chorus delivers the tragic downward turn, katastrophe, both literally and figuratively, we can in turn protest to stand our ground, to hold on to, Katechon, our position in the mysterion in which we act. The end time, if such a time indeed comes, would imply a position in which the good and the bad are separated from each other and the mystery is undone. There would be no more time to work for salvation in terms of working for good. The last judgment that cannot be appealed replaces relative judgments. Truth is revealed, which means the end of humans trying to approximate truth in a final disastrous revelation that spells the end of pharmacology and therapeutics. Here it must be remembered that it does not matter if the apocalypse is written in the stars or not. The problem of the belief in the end of time is, as Paul shows, maybe more problematic than the absence of eschatological thinking. The Thessalonians have stopped to work. They no longer believe that they can have an influence over their position and contribute to their own salvation, and have started dangerously to act as if this question has already been settled. In absolutely believing that the future is already understood, they have seemingly lost their capacity to dream and to wish in any positive sense. They act as if everything was expected, which means that they are rendered passive, and they have no need for institution, society, or each other, as they believe they are at the end. Maybe the most debilitating is that the Thessalonians have rejected the notion that there is an exception to the law, an opening towards an improbability outside of the calculable that Bernard Stiegler writes about in La Société Automatique. The Thessalonians here take the guise of a parable of what would be the consequences of an also completely automated society, in which all criteria for decisions and thinking are outsourced and desire destroyed as a consequence. In these absolutely automated societies, the inhabitants stop dreaming. That is, they stop wishing or desiring the improbable, and thus lose their ability to de-automate what structures their behavior. The aim of Paul's intervention, that is to open the door for the exception, for the improbable, remains crucial. And this is not a mystery in terms of divine metaphysics, rather an earthly drama of changing positions and the creation of new criteria by which to structure desire. But this is something that demands work, not merely in individual spiritual contemplation, but first and foremost in defending the community, the congregation, society, and all other institutions that belong to earthly existence and through which we jointly develop criteria for how to live together. Again, we can assume that this work for Paul, as for Lorenzetti, is conceived as a therapeutic service in which the aim is to transform the bad into something good. The absolute pretension, imagining the end, turned into a regressive act for the Thessalonians. The idle waiting becomes unconscious repetitions of the present. This is also how Freud describes the death drive in his 1920 Beyond the Pleasure Principle, not as the conscious projection towards a future demise, as in a realization of our mortality, but as an unconscious repetition of life turning into a dream of regression towards an inanimate condition that existed before existence. Freud here invokes this compulsive repetition with a citation from Nietzsche regarding the eternal recurrence of the same, a concept already prefigured by the devil in the Nightmare of Ivan in Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. In this repetition, and in contrast to Deleuze's interpretation of the repetition as generating difference, there is no scope for creation. Everything remains or returns to the same. All energy dissipates, a perfect image of entropy, in other words. That it is the devil that proclaims sameness as entropy in Brothers Karamazov is interesting when taking into account Victor Ségalen's essai sur l'exotisme, published posthumously long after the author's death, 1919. Ségalen, whose almost preternatural impact can be traced to a current of post-war French philosophy that goes from Claude Lévi-Strauss to Jacques Lacan to Jacques Derrida and Gilles Deleuze, here represents entropy, and I cite, comme un plus terrible monstre que le néant, end of citation, a non-differentiated and static leveling of energy. For Ségalen, this is countered by a highly abstract force that he calls the exotic. This force, and here we can sidestep all the colonial implication of what he's saying, can also be named eros with Freud and negentropy with Schrödinger. The exotic he describes as, I quote, la notion de différent, or la perception du divers, end of citation. The knowledge that something is not wholly itself, which translates into an ability to see the other. It can also be understood as the improbable and the non-calculable, a fundamental anti-nihilism, the ability to dream about creation and a de-automation of expectation. Messianic thinking implies a radical split between yet at the same time the eventual coexistence of the Antichrist with the Savior, the latter arriving later to the scene. Or, after Ségalen and Schrödinger, a split between entropy and negentropy. Therapeutic thinking, on the other hand, represents the hope that the two can be bridged in a process of translation from bad to good. This also means that Messianic thinking as an entropic practice can be turned towards the negentropy of therapeutics. It is important to remember that the pharmacon is always fractal. This also when the pharmacon is absolute, or an absolute epoché, being the epoché of absolute knowledge in literature, which can be read as through Derrida as an instance when it never leaves the textual, fictional level, as in his description of the nuclear war, rather than something entirely bad. Pharmacology is thus always a hope, an affirmation of difference. Two of Freud's texts on dreaming, separated by the horrors of the Great War, the 1899 interpretation of dreams and the 1920 Beyond the Pleasure Principle, can be seen as representing the early therapeutic Freud and the later messianic and progressively nihilistic version. It is this latter version that famously introduces the death drive, the compulsive and entropic repetition. The first work, in contrast, upholds at almost every turn the principle that dreams are expressions of wishes, and the wishes can be known through the work of interpretation. A work that manages to elucidate the difference between the manifest dream content and the latent dream thoughts, and in this difference locate the wish or desire. In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud retreats and claims that dreams not fulfilling wishes can indeed exist, and thus opens the door to the death drive. In both works, Freud leans explicitly on Nietzsche, but in radically different ways. The dream for Freud first disguises itself endlessly through the transvaluation of all values, an expression he borrows from Nietzsche's Antichrist from 1895. Then, in 1920, it is as though the dream is no longer capable of always producing difference, when it's found to be able to give rise to the eternal recurrence of the same, in Freud's interpretation of that, first expressed in The Gay Science from 1882. It is though Freud was gradually giving up the hope in collective work, which the interpretation and analysis is, a tendency that was accentuated in Civilization and its discontents from 1930. In the interpretation of dream, Freud takes a clearly identifiable pleasure in locating the wish in even the most gruesome nightmares. A wish in no way needs to be good for the individual or for society, but that can, through analysis, be used therapeutically and thus lead to something good, like health, which is the ultimate aim, obviously. The key here is the role of interpretation. His model of regression is also different from the one he presents in 1921. Rather than being the drive to return to the immaterial by becoming more and more infantile in our repetitions, regression is a matter of changing the directionality of the psychic apparatus in the interpretation of dreams. Conscious physical processes, he postulates, pass from perceptions of the outside world to memory traces that we can compare to retention, to emerge on the motor end as action. So here you see perceptions leading to M, to motor actions in the world, and a clarification of that with the memory traces that exist in between. So the regression of the dream is merely that it regresses back to sensibilities, that it never reaches the motor end, which one can see that the therapeutic act would then again launch the dreamer into a mode of executing the desire that is expressed in the dream, or using that desire towards the motor end. But it's something that goes back and forth, not like in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, where it's with absolute infantile regression to the past. But here it's much more dynamic. Yeah, so the dream is a special type of regression as a wish, which can be seen as a protension that is supplied by the unconscious system made up by the memory traces, the retentions. So this in contrast to the Beyond the Pleasure Principle, where Freud speculates that the death drive can override the production of a wish, leading to regression and a repetition in which nothing new is created, the probable and calculable dream, in other words. So the new, or to use an anachronistic term, negentropic, is for Freud in 1899 the outcome of a work elucidating the difference between the manifest and latent content of the dream, with a conscious knowledge of what the dream might want to say, taking into account the history or anamnesis of the analysand. And the first dream analyzed is famously one of Freud's own, the dream of Irma's injection, that literally deals with pharmaca, cures and toxins, and Freud's worries about being a good doctor or not. So the first dream of psychoanalysis is thus significantly about pharmacology and the therapeutics involved when trying to achieve the good. Psychoanalysis, I suggest, can be interpreted as a self-reflexive Katechon. The propaganda of messianic political projects in the 20th century has been one of the forces that rendered it difficult for art, like in Lorenzetti's time, to represent the two sides of man. This because the later representations were based on a messianic separation between the good and the bad, often linked to the fantasy that the bad belonged to someone else and thus could be eradicated, a framing that has contributed to so many killings in the name of ideas. But this did not mean that art, created by the heirs of Lorenzetti, no longer could present a wish to be interpreted, a work contributing to the possibility of therapeutics by accepting the presence of the toxin, yet at the same time contrasting it to something stronger. Marcel Duchamp engaged with the ready-made of industrial culture and opened a new world. So did Joseph Beuys and Ansel Kiefer with their investigations of German mythology after the Second World War, a war that had to such a large extent been inspired by badly digested mythological thinking. It's just an example from Ansel Kiefer, the Rhine series. There are also contemporary examples engaging with the theme of the catastrophe in a way that are open to difference and thus provide a counter-narrative to the same catastrophe. The problem as far as art is concerned, and here art, I use art as a general term for a potential space of negentropic de-automation and trans-individuation, lies in the extreme aestheticization of catastrophe, maybe most present in string of photographic representations of post-industrial landscapes. For example, Yves Marchand and Romain Maff, I think it's wrong in the text, the name. Their famous series, The Ruins of Detroit, sorry. These appear to create perpetual loops in Freud's first model of regression, back to the sensation of perception, away from the motor or conscious end that can, via interpretation, lead to action. They actively discourage the work of interpretation, but this does not mean that they are uninterpretable, following Freud's second model of regression. On the contrary, they seem to portray a not inconsiderable enjoyment over the gradual demise of the USA as a superpower. Still, they are presented as documentary in both the popular and specialized discourse, as reality overlapping with the dream. They have begun to depart from the realm of art to enter into the automated industrial production of images of late capitalism, a production that wishes to structure our dreams by bypassing conscious interpretation and the work of therapeutics. This leads to fostering of idle automations incapable of the improbable. So art can be a pharmacological cure to automation, as de-automation is an epoche of absolute knowledge, or the mystery of lawlessness, and opens the door for the relative judgment of therapeutic against the absolute judgment of the messianic. It is interpretation, and it generates new interpretation. Therapeutics as Katechon, between the poles of what Lorenzetti represented as the bad and the good, is intense work, as in Le Travail d'une Différence from Bernard's latest book. But it is at the same time, like the purgatory in Dante, the realm of both death and life, a mountain that heals or absolves by being climbed. Dante's fictional companion, Virgil, famously wrote that labor conquers everything. The idleness of revelation conquers nothing. At best, it perpetuates the pre-existing condition. The global situation, especially in light of the climate crisis, shows that even the preservation of the status quo is impossible without the creation of difference or the new. The work needed, to be precise, is one of therapeutics, true interpretation, including a reinterpretation of Freud's end of interpretation as expressed in his formulation of the death trial. This re-evaluation of the difference inherent in Freud's notion of the wish can only happen through a positive regression leading back to action, from messianic to therapeutic time. Despite the overly Christian language that I've been using and that surrounds the question of the Eschaton, the single belief necessary is that it is only before the end that difference as hope is possible. Thank you very much.